The 16th of December in 1944 found SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper positioned in the dense, snow-laden woods of the Ardennes, his eyes tracking the movement of his armoured beasts as they carved through the positions held by American forces. These weren't just any tanks. They represented the finest machinery the Panzerwaffe could still field. And for those initial hours of the assault, it seemed almost possible that the lunatic gamble conceived in the bunker back in Berlin might actually bear fruit. Peiper commanded what was known as Kampfgruppe Peiper, essentially the leading edge of what would become the last major offensive operation the Third Reich would ever mount in the West. The chaos his formation was sowing among the surprised American units was exactly what the planners had hoped for. But here's the thing that gnawed at Peiper, the thing that kept drawing his attention away from the tactical situation unfolding before him. He wasn't studying enemy movements or analysing their defensive positions. Instead, his gaze kept returning to something far more mundane, yet infinitely more critical. The fuel gauges. Every single movement his Tigers and Panthers made, every lurch forward through the frozen forest, every turn of their tracks drained away the liquid that represented the only thing standing between a genuine breakthrough and a collection of immobilized steel hulks scattered across the Belgian countryside. The entire operation, this desperate last attempt to change the trajectory of Germany's war, rested on three pillars. Audacity, because the plan itself was borderline insane. Surprise, because without catching the Americans completely off guard, they had no chance whatsoever. And finally, a prayer. That prayer was for fuel. The operational planners had told Peiper and the other commanders something that sounded almost too good to be true. They said the enemy would essentially supply their own advance. The idea was that the Americans, soft and undisciplined as German propaganda portrayed them, would simply abandon their massive supply reserves in the face of the unexpected onslaught. And there, in those snow-covered Belgian forests, something remarkable did happen. Peiper's men would indeed stumble across something that seemed almost heaven-sent. An enormous American fuel depot filled with jerry cans and drums containing more gasoline than they'd seen in months. For just a brief moment, it genuinely felt like divine intervention, like the universe was validating their desperate gamble. But that sensation of miraculous salvation turned out to be built on sand. The discovery wouldn't deliver them from their predicament. Instead, it would hammer home a truth so devastating, so mathematically certain, that it would drain whatever hope remained from even the most fanatical among them. It would demonstrate, with brutal clarity, exactly how American logistics were going to systematically crush this final desperate throw of the dice. By autumn of 1944, the Third Reich found itself in a stranglehold that was growing tighter with each passing day. From the eastern territories, the Red Army advanced like some unstoppable force of nature, grinding inexorably toward Berlin itself. Meanwhile, in the west, Allied armies had fought their way to Germany's doorstep and were preparing to kick the door in. For the generals of the German High Command, the strategic situation had moved well past concerning and into the realm of catastrophic. But in the mind of the madman who ruled from Berlin, this dire situation represented something entirely different. He saw it as the canvas upon which he would paint one final epic masterpiece, one last spectacular act of destruction that would turn everything around. The operation carried the codename Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, deliberately chosen to sound defensive and boring, the better to maintain operational security. The concept was audacious to the point of delusion. 3 entire German armies, with their remaining panzer divisions forming the armoured spearhead, would smash through what intelligence suggested was a weak section of the American line in the Ardennes region. Once through, they would drive hard for the Meuse River, cross it, and then achieve the ultimate objective. They would sever the connection between British and American forces, splitting the Allied armies in two. But the real prize, the objective that everything else supported, was the port city of Antwerp. Its capture wasn't just important, it was everything. The Führer didn't merely believe that seizing Antwerp would cripple Allied logistics. He promised his skeptical generals that the vast supply stockpiles accumulated there would re-equip Germany's own starving armies. This fundamental reliance on captured enemy supplies wasn't simply one component of the operational plan. It essentially was the plan. The reason was simple and devastating. Germany was hemorrhaging resources at a rate that couldn't be sustained. Allied strategic bombing had systematically dismantled the Reich's synthetic fuel production facilities, reducing output by a staggering 90% compared to previous years. The oil fields at Ploiești in Romania, which had once supplied Germany with crucial petroleum, were now firmly in Soviet hands. The consequences of this fuel starvation showed up everywhere you looked. The Luftwaffe, once the terrifying aerial arm of German military might, was increasingly grounded. Even the advanced jet aircraft that German engineers had developed couldn't fly without kerosene, and there simply wasn't enough to go around. On the home front throughout Germany, civilian vehicles had virtually disappeared from the roads. The Gestapo devoted significant resources to hunting down black market gasoline dealers, treating them with the same severity they applied to suspected resistance members or traitors to the state. The raw numbers tell the story with brutal honesty. Throughout 1944, the entire German war economy, utilizing every refinery, every synthetic fuel plant, every source available, managed to produce approximately 33 million barrels of oil. During that exact same period, the United States alone, not counting its allies, produced 1.8 billion barrels. Think about that disparity for a moment. A single oil field in East Texas generated more petroleum than all of German-controlled Europe combined. While American refineries actually conducted experiments to find uses for excess crude oil to avoid waste, German quartermasters faced agonizing daily decisions about which armored units would receive enough fuel to operate and which would have to remain stationary. When German planners sat down to calculate the fuel requirements for the Ardennes offensive, they came to a sobering conclusion. They had stockpiled enough gasoline to get their spearhead units approximately 1/3 of the way to Antwerp. Just 1/3. The remaining 2/3 of the journey, they were explicitly told, would have to be fueled by capturing American supplies. So the dice were loaded from the start as those Panzers rolled forward into the snow, their crews literally praying for that miracle fuel windfall that would allow them to continue the advance. The armoured fist of the offensive was designated the 6th Panzer Army, commanded by SS General Sepp Dietrich, and the sharpest point of that fist was Kampfgruppe Peiper. Peiper and his soldiers embodied everything the Nazi military establishment valued. They were fanatical believers, they were battle-hardened veterans, and they operated some of the most feared combat vehicles the war had produced. Their equipment represented the apex of German armoured development. The Tiger II, known to the Allies as the King Tiger, and the Panther medium tank. The Tiger II was an absolute monster of a machine, with thick sloped armour that made it virtually impervious to any Allied tank gun when engaged from the front, and it mounted a fearsome 88mm gun that could destroy enemy armour at ranges they couldn't even hope to return fire from. The Panther, meanwhile, many experts considered the best all-around tank design of the entire war, combining excellent firepower, good armour protection, and reasonable mobility. But these magnificent machines shared a terrible characteristic: an unquenchable thirst for fuel. Peiper understood the mathematics perfectly. Each of his Tiger II heavy tanks consumed roughly 2.5 gallons of gasoline for every single mile of forward movement under ideal conditions. In the rough terrain of the Ardennes, with its hills and forests and muddy roads, that consumption rate could easily double or even triple. To put it in perspective, for every single gallon of fuel an American Sherman tank burned, a Tiger II required 3 gallons to travel the same distance. For a country that had virtually no fuel production, fielding an army equipped with such gas-guzzling behemoths was a paradox born from a fundamentally flawed philosophy: the belief that superior quality could always triumph over inferior quantity. But that philosophy conveniently ignored a basic truth that became increasingly apparent as the war ground on. A tank that cannot move is nothing more than a very expensive pillbox, a stationary defensive position. The challenge of keeping these beasts mobile created a logistical nightmare that compounded existing problems. The sheer variety of vehicle types in a typical Panzer division, once considered a strength allowing flexibility, now meant that different engines required different fuels, different lubricants, different spare parts. Countless trucks were required just to transport fuel from rear depots to the frontline formations, and each one of those trucks presented a priority target for the Allied fighter bombers, those dreaded Jabos that dominated the daylight skies. By December of 1944, the German supply chain had become a case study in desperation and improvisation. Fuel was siphoned from damaged vehicles that couldn't be repaired. Captured Allied jeeps were immediately drained of whatever gasoline remained in their tanks. A commander like Peiper might have nearly 100 tanks assigned to his Kampfgruppe on paper, but if he only possessed enough fuel to actually move 30 of them, his effective combat power was crippled before the first shot was fired. The entire plan depended on these thirsty predators living off the land, feeding on the arterial supply network of their enemy. They were hunters being sent into the wilderness, expected to sustain themselves by consuming their prey. While Germany fought on fumes and desperation, America was conducting a global war fueled by what seemed like an inexhaustible geyser of petroleum. To the average American soldier serving in Europe, fuel was like air itself. It was simply always there, always available. You didn't worry about it. The colossal system that made this casual abundance possible represented one of the greatest logistical triumphs of the entire war, though it received far less attention than the combat operations it enabled. At the heart of this system was something called the Red Ball Express. When Allied armies advanced so rapidly after the breakout from Normandy that they literally outran their own supply lines, a solution had to be improvised quickly. What emerged was a 24-hour, 7-day-per-week convoy operation of trucks running on a one-way loop, with roads completely closed to all other military traffic. At the peak of operations, nearly 6,000 trucks, most of them rugged GMC vehicles known as Jimmies, driven predominantly by African-American soldiers who performed this crucial but often overlooked work, became the lifeblood feeding the advance across France. In just 82 days of operation, they delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to the frontline forces. The operation itself was so massive in scale that it consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel every single day just to keep its own trucks moving. A German army group commander responsible for hundreds of thousands of troops would have literally wept to have access to that much fuel for his combat operations. But the Red Ball Express was just one component of a much larger system. An even more incredible engineering feat was something codenamed Operation Pluto, which stood for Pipeline Under the Ocean. Engineers designed flexible 3-inch diameter pipelines that were laid across the English Channel, creating a continuous, unstoppable river of fuel flowing directly from England to the European continent. From the coastal depots where these pipelines terminated, smaller branch pipelines extended outward, following the advancing armies like a circulatory system, pumping hundreds of thousands of gallons daily toward the front lines. The scale of this logistical achievement is genuinely staggering when you examine the numbers. In late 1944, Allied forces operating in northwest Europe were burning through approximately 7.5 million gallons of fuel every single day. The US First Army alone, the very force that would absorb the initial German attack in the Ardennes, maintained a reserve stockpile of 3.5 million gallons. One of the larger pipeline systems could deliver 300,000 gallons in a single day, day after day, without interruption. This wasn't merely a numerical advantage, though the numbers were certainly overwhelming. It fundamentally changed the Allied operational mindset and planning assumptions. American commanders developed and executed their battle plans with the comfortable knowledge that fuel was essentially a given, a constraint they rarely needed to worry about. While German generals agonized over every single kilometer of movement, rationing fuel like misers, American generals casually planned offensive operations spanning entire countries, knowing the gas would be there when needed. This rolling tide of petroleum, this ocean of fuel, was about to collide head-on with the sputtering, desperate advance of the Panzers. On the 16th of December, the Ardennes erupted. The German offensive achieved something that had become increasingly rare: total tactical surprise. Through the gaps torn in the American defensive lines poured the men and machines of Kampfgruppe Peiper and the other assault formations. For Peiper's command, the advance was fundamentally a race, not primarily against American reinforcements, but against their own fuel tanks steadily draining toward empty. Then, near a small village called Honsfeld, they hit what seemed like the jackpot they'd been promised. Overrunning what had been a rest area for an American armored division, they discovered something that seemed almost too good to be true: a United States fuel and supply depot, apparently abandoned in the hasty American withdrawal. To the fuel-starved German soldiers who had spent years scrounging for every single drop of foul-smelling ersatz synthetic fuel, this discovery felt like stumbling into paradise itself. After years of deprivation, they suddenly stood in a forest that served as a monument to industrial abundance. One German officer who was present later described seeing walls of sturdy, well-made American jerry cans stacked 10 feet high, forming long corridors through the trees. The air, which had been thick with the scent of pine and snow, now carried the sharp, almost intoxicating smell of high-grade, high-octane gasoline. This was 80-plus octane fuel, a world away from the 74-octane fuel that their own engines were forced to struggle with. The initial estimates reported back to headquarters were euphoric in tone: 50,000 gallons. This single, relatively minor capture represented more fuel than many German divisions had seen in months of operations. It was enough to completely refuel Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe and provide sufficient fuel for the dash to the Meuse River. The soldiers were absolutely ecstatic. They interpreted it as a sign, as validation. The decadent Americans were so careless with their vast wealth that they simply abandoned precious supplies. Meanwhile, the disciplined, superior German soldiers would make every drop count. But then, as the initial euphoria began to fade and officers started examining the captured depot more carefully, conducting proper inventories and inspecting what they'd found, a different picture began to emerge. The intoxication of the discovery started giving way to something else entirely. Among the supplies and ammunition, soldiers found discarded American newspapers, recent ones. On the jerry cans themselves, they found shipping manifests, logistical documentation. A logistics officer studying these mundane documents would have experienced a growing sense of dread as the implications became clear. The newspapers were recent, dated within the past few weeks, but it was the manifests that told an almost impossible story. These jerry cans, filled with gasoline that had been refined in distant Texas, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean, been unloaded at ports in France, and then transported by truck to this forward depot in the Ardennes. The entire journey, from American refinery to Belgian forest, had taken less than 6 weeks. This wasn't some long-forgotten stockpile that had been sitting here for months. This was a single drop from a river that was constantly flowing. The true psychological collapse, the moment when hope began to curdle into despair, came with an even bigger discovery. They learned details about the Allied pipeline system. They discovered that a single underground pipeline, and there were several feeding the front, could deliver 300,000 gallons of fuel every single day. 300,000 gallons daily. A German Panzer division during a month of intense combat operations might burn through that much fuel total. Here was an invisible tube buried in the ground that delivered more fuel in 24 hours than an entire armoured division could hope to receive in 30 days. Suddenly, that 50,000-gallon jackpot that had seemed so miraculous minutes earlier appeared pathetic. It wasn't a strategic prize. It was pocket change. It was the equivalent of a millionaire dropping a $20 bill on the sidewalk and not even bothering to pick it up. The Americans hadn't lost this fuel in any meaningful sense. Its loss represented nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a rounding error in their logistical calculations. For years, German propaganda had painted America as a soft nation, a mongrel society incapable of the total war that Germany waged. That comforting lie now lay shattered in the Belgian snow alongside the discarded newspapers and manifests. As one German soldier later wrote in his diary, attempting to process what he'd learned, how could you possibly defeat an enemy who treated a quantity of fuel that could save your entire army as little more than a trivial loss, barely worth noting? The discovery of that fuel dump, which had initially seemed like such a tremendous victory, became the moment when many of them understood with cold certainty that the war was already lost, that they were simply going through the motions toward an inevitable conclusion. This shift from tactical victory to strategic despair represents one of the most psychologically fascinating aspects of the Battle of the Bulge. It demonstrates that wars are ultimately won not just through tactical brilliance on the battlefield, though that certainly matters, but through production capacity on the factory floor and through the gradual erosion or strengthening of morale and will in the minds of the soldiers doing the fighting. The true mind-bending extent of American industrial power wasn't really demonstrated by the fuel the Germans managed to find and capture. It was revealed by the fuel they were systematically denied access to. American commanders, when faced with the German offensive, made a calculation that was both simple and ruthless in its logic. If the Germans desperately needed American fuel to sustain their offensive, then that fuel had to be destroyed before they could capture it. What followed was an act of material destruction so profound, so utterly alien to the German mindset shaped by years of scarcity, that it represented one of the ultimate demonstrations of industrial superiority in military history. Near the town of Stavelot, lying directly in Peiper's projected path of advance, sat another fuel depot. Not 50,000 gallons this time. This facility held 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's tanks drew closer to the town, a small group of American combat engineers received their orders. Destroy it all. Every drop. Try to imagine this situation from the German perspective for a moment. Your tanks are literally running on fumes. Your nation's last hope for changing the trajectory of the war is grinding to a halt because you don't have fuel. And then, over the next hill, you see a massive pillar of thick black smoke rising into the winter sky. You hear a tremendous roar. And if you're close enough, you can actually see American soldiers methodically opening the spigots on thousands of fuel drums, deliberately letting that precious liquid pour into drainage ditches, and then setting it ablaze. At Stavelot, at Malmedy, at Spa, the story repeated itself with minor variations. American engineers opened valves, tossed in grenades, and watched as flames consumed what the Germans would have considered irreplaceable treasure. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 8 million gallons of gasoline went up in smoke during just the first week of the battle. 8 million gallons. That single week of intentional, systematic destruction represented more gasoline than the German High Command had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive from start to finish. To the German soldiers witnessing this or hearing reports about it, the act was utterly incomprehensible waste on a scale that defied understanding. It was like watching a starving man deliberately burn down a granary full of grain. But to the American commanders who ordered it, this was simply sound military doctrine, a logical decision. The fuel loss was trivial in the larger scheme. The supply system was already compensating for it, already flowing more fuel forward to replace what had been destroyed. The mathematics of the situation were stark. On December 17th, the United States First Army destroyed approximately 2.2 million gallons of fuel to prevent capture. The very next day, December 18th, 1.8 million gallons of fresh fuel were delivered to them through the pipeline system and convoy trucks. By Christmas Eve, roughly a week into the battle, their total fuel reserves had actually increased compared to when the German attack began. This systematic denial of captured fuel effectively sealed the fate of Kampfgruppe Peiper. Blocked by unexpectedly stubborn American resistance at key road junctions, denied the fuel they desperately needed as it literally went up in smoke on the horizon, their advance sputtered and died near a small town called La Glaise. Peiper's mighty Tiger II heavy tanks, those fearsome machines that were nearly invincible in direct combat, became nothing more than immobile steel coffins. On Christmas Eve, Peiper was forced to make the most painful decision of his military career. He had to abandon all of his heavy equipment. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who had started the attack with such high hopes just over a week earlier, only about 800 managed to make it back to German lines. And they made it back on foot, having walked through the snow. They weren't beaten by superior American tanks or brilliant tactical maneuvers. They were beaten by empty fuel gauges and by fighting an enemy who could afford to fight with fire itself, who could afford to destroy more resources than Germany could produce. When the guns finally fell silent in late January of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was rightfully hailed as a great American military victory. And it absolutely was a significant victory, achieved through the courage and sacrifice of the soldiers who fought in brutal winter conditions. But the reality is that the battle had already been won long before the first shot was fired in the Ardennes. It was won in the oil fields of Texas and Oklahoma and California. It was won in the automobile factories of Detroit that had converted to tank production. It was won in the shipyards of California and the East Coast that built the cargo vessels. It was won in the minds of American planners who understood that modern war was as much about logistics and production as it was about tactics and courage. The Ardennes offensive represented the death rattle of the German war machine. Germany threw its last reserve of elite troops and its best remaining armour into one final desperate gamble and lost everything. When you strip away all the tactical details and study the battle at its most fundamental level, the single most important reason for the failure was logistics. The entire operational plan was a fantasy built on the assumption that they could capture supplies from an enemy that had far too much to ever miss what was taken. Consider again that stark numerical contrast that defined the entire conflict. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 50 times more crude oil than Germany and all of its occupied territories combined. While German industrial capacity was being systematically bombed into rubble, Ford's Willow Run factory was churning out a complete B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes around the clock. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them, reversing the strategic equation that had nearly won Germany the Battle of the Atlantic earlier in the war. The Battle of the Bulge was the moment when this overwhelming statistical reality became an undeniable psychological truth that penetrated even the most fanatical beliefs. It marked the brutal end of the romantic notion that superior will and fighting spirit could somehow triumph over massive material disadvantage. The image of the dashing Panzer ace, the individual hero making the difference, was rendered obsolete by the anonymous truck driver on the Red Ball Express who ensured the fuel kept flowing. Winston Churchill, with his characteristic way with words, observed that petrol governed every movement in modern warfare. Joseph Stalin, always more blunt and direct, stated flatly that the war was decided by engines and octane. The German soldiers who stumbled upon that fuel dump near Honsfeld in the early hours of the offensive thought they had discovered the key that would unlock victory, the miracle they'd been promised. What they had actually found was a measuring stick, a yardstick that revealed the vast, unbridgeable chasm between their exhausted, bled-out nation and the industrial colossus they had so foolishly and catastrophically underestimated when they declared war. They were fighting with swords and individual skill against an enemy wielding an assembly line, against a foe who had turned warfare into an industrial process. The story of the Battle of the Bulge and those American fuel dumps serves as a perfect microcosm of the entire Second World War in Europe. The discovery of that single stockpile, representing more material wealth than an entire German division could dream of accessing in months, became a powerful symbol of a conflict that had moved beyond the traditional battlefield and into the realm of industrial and economic warfare. This was fundamentally a clash between two completely different systems. One system was running on the last fumes of a fanatical ideology, sustained by propaganda and increasingly desperate measures. The other was powered by what seemed like an almost limitless river of industrial production, by an economy that had successfully converted to total war production while still maintaining civilian morale. The German soldiers' shock upon discovering the truth about American logistics wasn't simply about the fuel itself, though that was certainly part of it. It was the soul-crushing realization that they were fighting an enemy who could afford to be casually wasteful on a scale they couldn't even begin to imagine in their wildest estimates. It proved beyond any doubt that in modern industrialized warfare, the greatest weapon isn't always the most advanced tank or the most skilled soldier, though those things matter. The greatest weapon is the ability to supply your forces endlessly, to replace losses faster than they occur, to treat logistics as a problem you've already solved rather than a constant crisis. The mathematical certainty of their defeat was written in those shipping manifests found on abandoned jerry cans, in the newspapers showing the efficiency of American logistics, in the very abundance that surrounded them. Every drum of fuel, every abandoned supply dump, every item of equipment told the same story. America could produce faster than Germany could destroy. America could transport supplies across an ocean faster than Germany could move them across its own shrinking territory. America could afford to burn millions of gallons rather than let them fall into enemy hands, while Germany couldn't produce enough fuel to move its own tanks. This industrial and logistical superiority manifested in countless ways throughout the battle. American artillery units could fire vastly more shells because supply wasn't a constraint. American soldiers were better fed because the supply chain functioned. American vehicles were more reliable because they were built with abundant raw materials rather than ersatz substitutes. American tanks could maneuver freely because fuel was available. Even something as simple as winter clothing made a difference. American troops received proper winter gear, while many German soldiers still wore summer uniforms in the December snow. None of these individual advantages were necessarily decisive on their own, but taken together, they created an overwhelming cumulative effect that no amount of individual courage or tactical skill could overcome. The battle demonstrated that modern war had become a test of industrial systems rather than just military systems. Peiper's elite Kampfgruppe, superbly trained and equipped with technologically superior tanks, was defeated not by better American tanks, but by better American logistics. The Tiger IIs that could destroy any Allied tank in a fair fight never got that fair fight because they couldn't move, couldn't maneuver, couldn't respond to threats. They sat immobile, out of fuel, waiting to be destroyed or abandoned. The German High Command had understood intellectually that fuel was going to be a problem, which is why the plan explicitly relied on captured supplies. But understanding something intellectually and truly grasping its implications are two different things. They gambled that American forces would be so disorganized and demoralized by the surprise attack that they would abandon supplies in their retreat. They gambled that American logistics would prove fragile, that the appearance of abundance masked underlying weaknesses. They gambled that they could move fast enough to capture fuel before it could be destroyed. They lost every single one of those gambles. American forces, despite being surprised and initially pushed back, maintained enough cohesion to implement demolition plans. American logistics proved robust, rapidly adjusting to the changed situation. And American commanders were willing to destroy their own supplies rather than let them fall into enemy hands, a decision that would have been unthinkable to fuel-starved German planners. The burning of those fuel dumps, that tremendous display of material superiority, sent shockwaves through the German ranks. Officers who witnessed it or heard reports struggled to maintain the morale of their men. How do you ask soldiers to keep fighting when they can see such overwhelming evidence of their disadvantage? How do you maintain belief in victory when the enemy treats as disposable what you treat as irreplaceable? The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. For years, German propaganda had sustained morale by claiming that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity, that German soldiers were inherently superior, that German technology was unbeatable. The Ardennes offensive shattered these comfortable myths. Quality didn't matter when you couldn't move. Superior soldiers couldn't fight without supplies. Advanced technology was useless without fuel. The abundance they encountered in the captured dumps, and even more so the abundance they saw being deliberately destroyed, revealed that the entire ideological framework was built on lies. Many German soldiers later wrote about experiencing a kind of psychological breaking point during the battle, a moment when they stopped believing in the possibility of victory and began simply trying to survive. For some, that moment came when they saw the fuel burning. For others, it came when they examined the shipping manifests and did the mathematics. For still others, it came when they were forced to abandon their tanks and walk back through the snow. But the common thread was the realization that they weren't just losing a battle. They were being systematically defeated by an opponent playing an entirely different kind of war. The Americans weren't trying to outfight them. They were trying to outproduce them. And it was working. The Ardennes offensive burned through Germany's last strategic reserves without achieving any of its objectives. The port of Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The British and American armies remained connected. The Allied supply line remained intact. And Germany's situation became even more desperate. The panzer divisions that had been destroyed or crippled in the Ardennes were divisions that couldn't defend against the Soviet offensive that was coming in the east. The fuel burned in the offensive was fuel that couldn't be used to defend Germany itself. In the final analysis, the Battle of the Bulge serves as a powerful case study in the importance of logistics in modern warfare. The tactical fighting certainly mattered. The courage of American soldiers holding key towns against overwhelming odds mattered. The decisions made by commanders on both sides mattered. But underlying everything, determining what was and wasn't possible, setting the parameters within which tactics could operate, was logistics. And in that fundamental contest, America held every advantage. The German soldier examining those captured jerry cans, reading the shipping manifests, calculating the impossible speed of American logistics, was witnessing the true nature of the war. It wasn't really a war between armies anymore. It was a war between economic systems, between industrial capacities, between two different visions of how to organize production and distribution. One system, the German one, was centralized, inefficient, increasingly desperate, running on ersatz substitutes and slave labor, and the plunder of conquered territories. The other system, the American one, was decentralized, efficient, abundant, running on genuine resources and voluntary labor and the productive capacity of an untouched homeland. The outcome was never really in doubt once you understood those fundamentals, but it took the shock of the Ardennes to make that truth undeniable even to the most committed believers in German victory. The pillars of black smoke rising from burning fuel dumps were funeral pyres for more than just gasoline. They marked the death of German hopes, the end of German illusions, the final proof that the war was lost. And the tragedy, if you can call it that, is that so many soldiers on both sides had to die before that mathematical certainty translated into actual surrender. The battle raged for another month after Christmas, with American forces gradually pushing the Bulge back and German forces fighting desperate rearguard actions. More men died, more equipment was destroyed, more resources were consumed, all to confirm what the logistics had already determined. The fuel that didn't burn in the dumps was used by American forces to conduct counteroffensives, to supply their armies, to maintain the pressure. The fuel that Germany didn't capture, couldn't produce, and couldn't replace left their forces increasingly immobile, increasingly vulnerable, increasingly doomed. By the time the battle officially ended in late January, the front lines had been essentially restored to where they started, but the cost to Germany was catastrophic and irreplaceable, while the cost to America, though painful, was sustainable and would be replaced. That asymmetry, that fundamental imbalance, was the story of the entire war condensed into 1 month of brutal winter fighting in Belgium and Luxembourg. The jerrycan that started as a symbol of German efficiency, copied by the Allies and mass-produced in American factories, ended up symbolizing the reversal of fortunes. The Germans had invented it, But the Americans filled it with cheap, abundant fuel and scattered them by the millions across Europe, while German soldiers scrounged for drops. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge taught a lesson that military planners have studied ever since. Logistics isn't boring or secondary. Logistics is fundamental. An army without supplies is just a mob. A tank without fuel is just a bunker. A soldier without ammunition is just a target. And a nation that cannot sustain its military forces cannot win a modern war, regardless of ideology, regardless of courage, regardless of technological sophistication. The smoke from those burning fuel dumps rose into the winter sky and dispersed, but the lesson remained.